This letter to the Corinthian church is not technically a doctrinal epistle. That doesn't mean it doesn't have doctrine in it. Could you turn me up just a little bit, David, please? Thank you. It doesn't fall into the category of doctrinal epistles such as Romans and Galatians, Ephesians, and Colossians. It is more of a corrective letter, and it is correcting all kinds of issues within the local church there at Corinth. And it's really inconceivable for Christians, most Christians in the Western culture, to comprehend the kind of problems that was going on in this church. And the reason, of course, is people brought in all kinds of immorality. They brought in their various philosophies and their culture. And some of these folks had absolutely no concept of biblical standards as far as marriage or divorce or incest or any of those things. And so this church here at Corinth, kind of the crossroads, had attracted, of course, many people had trusted Christ, but they bring in with them their baggage, and therefore in the church there were all kinds of issues. Now, in this chapter, we're going to actually look at some basic principles of marriage and the single life, and also a divorce and remarriage. And so you can see the importance, I think, of understanding this chapter when it comes to a Christian who wants to do right. Now, if you're a heathen, it really doesn't matter. But if you have any profession to be a child of God, then it ought to have some interest to you. Now, at this point in the letter, Paul begins to address some questions that they had asked him obviously in a letter that they had sent to him. Verse 1, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me." So they had written to Paul about this matter because there certainly was not any agreement on it, and no doubt a lot of immorality and a lot of confusion. And so he's going to discuss in this chapter the matter of marriage, divorce, and the single life. All three of those will be touched upon here in the first 24 verses. And then in the last part of it, he talks about the single life, that is by people who've never been married, and also by those who may be divorced. And here in general, actually, he gives instructions in the first few verses about marriage and its purpose and all of that. And in these first 9 verses, you'll notice that he says, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman." And the idea here is that it's good. That means that it's acceptable and better if a person doesn't get married. It's only better in that when, as he will bring out in this chapter, when a man or a woman is married, then much of their time is rightfully dedicated to taking care of and pleasing and helping their mate. And so it's good, he says, that for a person not to get married. It's okay. And, let me just give you some examples. Some years ago, you remember the Hale-Bopp or that comet or whatever that was? Remember that crowd? They killed themselves. Those people emasculated themselves because they believed it was wrong to have sex. Now that is a religious belief they had. And, I'm pretty strong in my faith, but I'm not that strong. Believe me. And then there are, those that who actually get married and still have abstained from sex. Then there are folks that don't get married and they never abstain from sex. And then there are those like that the compound down in Texas that believe that you can have as many wives as you can get, as well as Islam and so on. So you understand that just because you have a particular, or we have a particular Bible teaching about something, that most of the world is still in darkness in this matter. So Paul says in verse 1 and 2 that it is good to get married. That is, it's okay. It's a good thing, but it's not the best thing. And he'll point that out in this chapter. And the reason it's good to marry is, and really just about the only good thing about it that he points out. He says, now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, nevertheless to avoid fornication. Let every man have his own wife, and every woman her own husband. And so the major purpose in marriage is to satisfy sexual needs. And as a result of that, of course, the creation, the human race continues. And so he makes that very clear, that it is good, it is right, it's acceptable to get married to avoid sexual immorality. Now, we live in a society that sexual immorality is just a joke. In fact, there is no such thing as sexual immorality in our society. You know that, I know that. People just blink at it and wink at it. It means nothing. And in verse 3 and 4, he talks about the proper attitude to govern the marriage relationship. He says, let the husband render to his wife due benevolence, and likewise the wife unto the husband. And verse 4, the wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. Defraud you not one another, except it be for consent of a time. So he is making it very clear here that most people, have natural, physical needs, and it is the responsibility of the husband to meet those in his wife, and it is the responsibility of the wife to meet those in her husband. And in fact, he says, if you abstain from any length of time, he says there should be agreement, verse 5, defraud you not. A man will not have sex with his wife, or a wife who will not have sex with her husband defrauds him. It's called defrauding. Isn't that what it says? Defraud you not one another, but for a period of time with consent. And the reason for that is so the devil doesn't tempt you because of your lack of self-restraint, there in verse 5, the last part of it. So he makes it very clear that abstaining abstinence is appropriate for a short time if it is for dedication to the Lord, for prayer and fasting, which is a foreign teaching to the Americans. I mean, this is a foreign thing. But nevertheless, that's what it says. And but he goes on to say in verse 7 and through 9, actually he says in verse 6, I speak this by permission and not by commandment. Now he's not saying that what he is teaching is not appropriate. He's just saying I don't have a commandment of God or of the Lord, or the Lord has said something about this previously. he said, verse 7, for I would that all men were as I myself. Paul was a single man. Now, some people teach that he was married before, but there's not an ounce of proof for that. But it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter. But he said, I would that all men were even as I myself. That is, he said, if I had my way, I wish every man and woman were single for an obvious reason. For I would that all men were as myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God. And once again, this is talking about some people, by the grace of God, have the ability to abstain from sex and without temptation or sin. There are many, many people. I think sometimes we try to force young people into marriage, and they don't necessarily need it. They don't. They can, they got their bodies under control, and they're not driven by sex urges. And so he said that some people have that proper gift from God, that ability. There are many people who have never married so that they can dedicate themselves 100% to the Lord. If you're married, you cannot dedicate yourself 100% to the Lord because you've got a wife or a husband that you have to dedicate yourself to. And that's not dedicating to the Lord as the context here is talking about. Talking about time. It's talking about affection. It's talking about money. And you can't do that if you have a wife or a husband. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. He's not even saying it's wrong. He said it's okay. It's okay. But he's saying it's better if you can withstand. He said, verse 7, for I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, another after that. So everybody's not the same. Now everybody shouldn't be like you or like me or somebody else. And you shouldn't try to make other people like you or criticize them when they're not. Today, if somebody's not married early in life, we begin to question, are they kind of strange? No, they're smart. We think, well, if they're not dating by the time they're 15, they must be a queer. Why, that's stupid. See? But our culture has this, different cultures have this pressure on people, and if a guy is not interested in getting married, they think the guy is a homo or something. He may not be. And by the way, I don't raise the question. That does not enter into my mind. But that's our culture does that, you see. And verse 8 then, he says, I say therefore to the unmarried and the widows, who would be unmarried, of course, but there's two different classifications here of the unmarried. He says, I would say to the widows and the unmarried, it is good for them if they abide even as I. Now remember, all these questions are going on in this church about sex, about marriage, about the divorce, about all of this. And so Paul is addressing this question these questions that they had sent to him. And verse 8, he says, I say therefore to the unmarried, if you've never been married, or if you are a widow, it's good if you abide even as I, Paul says. But it isn't mandatory. And he'll bring that out very clearly later on. In fact, he says to the young widows, he said it's better for them to get married. Because in time, if they don't, they probably will fall into sexual sin and their heart will turn cold against God. So he said it's better for them if you're a young woman and your husband gets killed or dies, it's probably safer for you to get married. Okay, that's what he's saying he says that in another passage. And so that's kind of the general idea here. And then in verses 10 through 16, he talks about, and unto the married I command, yet not I. So now he says the Lord, Jesus had said something about this. He says, to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. So the Lord never advocates divorce. And of course, once again, we live in a society to where there is any reason for divorce. Doesn't make any difference. People are incompatible, irreconcilable differences. What does that mean? Just means we differ on where to put the money in the bank. What does it mean? We just differ. See? And so really, today, anything is any reason for divorce. And so Christians are no different in this, in most cases, than the world. So unto the married, he said, I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife leave her husband. But if she departs, now she can, there may be circumstances where she can, then let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. So the Lord is saying there, and for obvious reasons, that if people divorce and, they either let her depart or let she depart, or him, and let them remain unmarried or be reconciled to the husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. And of course, people have the question, I have an unsaved husband, or I have an unsaved wife. What should I do? Well, the answer is right here. The answer is right here. Some folks get this idea, I'll marry an unsaved boy and I'll win him to the Lord, and it never happens. Or she says, I'll marry this unsaved guy and he'll come around. He promised me he'd be a Christian. Yeah, sure. Sure. And so people wind up, and young girls who love the Lord and they want to marry a preacher, they want to go to the mission field, they believe this guy, they marry him, and they never get off of American soil, they never serve God. And the young lady now, it's usually the young lady that falls into this trap. And, she winds up deep in her heart, she's bitter because she wanted to serve God. And then when she comes to a mission conference, or comes to church and hears somebody preach about it, it opens up an old wound. She probably never say anything about it. But my husband promised me he'd go to the mission field. My husband promised me he would serve God. And she never forgets it. And so that thing is always there. And that's why I think a young girl, I don't care how good a soul winner a guy is at Bible college or church, or how good a bus captain he is, or how well he can sing, or how well he can do anything. It doesn't have any bearing on how good a Christian or a servant or a husband he's going to be. So you better look at that gate a long time. All right? So let not the wife depart from her husband. Now the Lord gives obvious reasons why a man or a woman has legal grounds to leave their husband or wife, and that's for adultery. It's for sexual immorality. And yet even then they don't have to get a divorce if they can forgive, and by the grace of God, and can work things out, then that is better. Now to the rest, he changes this now. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. Once again, the idea here is that the Lord Jesus never said anything about this. He's not saying I don't speak under inspiration. He's saying the Lord Jesus never said anything about this previously. He said, if a brother hath a wife that believeth not. So let's suppose that you may have married an unsaved man or a woman, and if you do, then their unsaved condition is not a grounds for a divorce, just because you have an unsaved wife or an unsaved husband. Now, obviously, this was a problem here because there would be perhaps two unsaved people maybe, and they were married, and one of them accepts Christ. They're at Corinth. Now, the question is, I'm a Christian. What am I supposed to do about my marriage? I'm saved. My spouse is not saved. Shall I leave my spouse and look for a saved man or a saved woman? And those are some of the questions that come up. So he says in verse 12, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. But if a brother, that's a saved man or woman, hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let her not put him away. So it's not grounds to get divorced, is what he's saying. If you have an unsaved husband or wife, and the unsaved one is content to dwell with you because even though you're a Christian, then God says you don't put them away, and vice versa. Okay? And let her not leave him. That is, of course, if she's a Christian and he isn't. Now, there's a reason for that. Verse 14, he said, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. And what that means, of course, is the wife has an influence. A Christian woman has an influence on an unsaved husband. Doesn't mean he's saved, but it means that really, because she is a Christian, he is in an environment, in a situation that sets him apart. That's all the word sanctify means. Doesn't mean you're saved. It means that he is dedicated to you, he is pleased to dwell with you, and your Christianity may win him to the Lord. On the other hand, the same thing's true with the man, and that's what this means. And if you have an unsaved partner and you have children, then your children are in an environment where they hear about the Bible and they hear about God, and they are set apart into a family situation to where they're going to see you pray, they're going to maybe go to church with you, and they're going to hear about the Lord and come to the Lord, right? So that's much better than getting a divorce just because you have an unsaved partner, because you can see what it does with the children in that situation. So he said it's better to stay together. And that's all this means when it says sanctified. It doesn't mean they're saved. It just means that they are set apart in an environment that is more conducive for them to become a Christian. And so the woman which hath a husband, verse 13, the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, else were your children unclean. That's the idea, simply means that they're out in the heathen world. That's all it means. Doesn't mean that, doesn't have any moral connotation as far as the spiritual value of the child. That's not what it's talking about. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. Once again, it doesn't mean that just because somebody in the family is a Christian, that the children are Christians. But it does mean that the environment is better for them. You understand that? That's what that is saying. All right? And so the husband's not to divorce his wife. And you know, in verse 16, well, let's see, did I get that far? Yes, verse 15, I guess. But if the unbelieving depart, let them depart. Now, if an unsaved woman is married to a Christian and she does not want to be with a Christian man now, then she's not bound to him. She can leave. Or the other way around. If that is the issue. But it says, but for the Christian, it says, if your unsaved mate is pleased to dwell with you, then you don't put them away because they're an unbeliever. So having an unbelieving husband or wife is not grounds for a divorce in this text or any other text here. It says a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such a case. And I will get back to this verse in just a minute. Now in verse 17 through 20, Paul also gives some instructions, some principles along this matter, as he had done before. And the Lord says in verse 17, but as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every man, so let him walk. Now remember I said earlier in this text that certain people have certain gifts in the matter of celibacy, and that is what it's talking about. If you look at verse 7, for I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, one after another. And so that's what you're getting at there in verse 17. But as God hath distributed to every man, if you have the ability to be celibate, stay that way. If you're married, stay that way. I mean, that's what it's saying. But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every man, so let him walk. So if God has called you, and by His grace you can live a celibate life, then walk that way. And if you need to get married, then get married. And that's what he says. So let him walk, and so ordain I in all the churches. He said, I teach this in all the churches. Verse 18, is any man called being uncircumcised? Then let him not become called circumcised. If he's a Jew, and circumcision was a big issue, then don't let him, he doesn't need to become a Gentile. Is any man uncircumcised? He's a Gentile. He doesn't need to become a Jew. He doesn't need to worry about circumcision. Verse 19, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. That's how Paul saw it. He said it's nothing. Now he's using that, of course, to illustrate this point. If you are called and gifted to be celibate, then stay that way. You don't need to get married. This is not a command, but he said stay that way. If you are married, whether it be to a saved person or an unsaved person, and that person's content to live with you, and you are married and you need to be married, and you were in that condition when you got saved, then he said stay that way. There's no command that you should separate and move those things. So he's just using circumcision here as an example that circumcision is nothing. Certainly the Orthodox Jews would have a major problem with that, but it didn't matter. Paul was a leader of the Jews. I mean, he was their teacher before he got saved. So he just basically says that. So therefore, verse 20, he said, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. In the context, if you were called or saved, celibate, and you're content, then he says stay that way. If you were married and you're content there, stay that way. And so that is the idea here. He takes it a little further. Verse 21, art thou called being a servant? That is, did you get saved and come to God? And you were a servant, that is a slave? Then he said, don't worry about it. You were a slave, and you have a slave master, and you became a Christian. Obviously, this is an issue. It's a question. It came up in this church, so Paul is answering it. He said, you got saved and you were a slave. Don't worry about it. He said, just, don't run away. In fact, Onesimus, if you remember, he ran away, and Paul wrote a letter told him to go back to his master. See? And so he said, let every man abide. In verse 21, art thou called, that is, you came to Christ, and you were a slave or a servant, care not for it. But he says, if you may be free, if they'll set you free, then use it rather. It's okay to get saved and remain a slave. You'd be loyal to your master. But he said, if you can get your freedom, then that's better. Because obviously it's better to be free if you can. And verse 22, for he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. So he's telling these slaves, if you have a slave owner and you are saved, you're the Lord's free man. You're free in the Lord. And I hope you can get a hold of what he's saying there. But you see, your circumstances really don't determine if you're free or not. A lot of people are walking the street in bondage. And some are in prison and they're free. Because you are really only a captive in your mind, and you're either free in your mind, and if you are not free, then you're a slave no matter where you are. I hope, and that needs to become a reality. Paul said, I've learned in whatsoever state therewith to be content. So when he was in prison, he and Silas, at midnight, they're singing praises to God. You see, while the jailers are complaining and grumbling about everything under the sun. See, so art thou free? Art thou called being a servant? That is, you got saved, called to God, and you are a servant, then care not for it. Don't worry about it. But if you may be made free, made free, use it rather. Use your freedom for the glory of God. You can do more as a free servant that is out that you could, in bondage or, belonging to a master, an earthly master. But he goes on to say in verse 22, for he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. You get it? So you can be a servant and be free, or you can be free and be a servant. Paul said, I'm free, but I've made myself servant to all men, that by all means I might win some. So a free man can become a servant, and a servant may be able to become a free man so he could do more. All right? And let's see. Down about verse 20, art thou called? Verse 23, you're bought with a price, so be ye not servants of men. Now, once again, he's not saying that you should rebel in anarchy against your servant, but he's simply saying that you are bought with a price, and even if you have a master, you ought to serve him as though you're serving the Lord. That's the idea. You see, I've heard people say, well, I don't serve any man. Then you don't serve God either. You're just kidding yourself. Say, I don't serve any men. Well, then you don't serve God, because God tells you to do that. See, Paul said, I've made myself servant to all men, that I might by all means win some to Christ. And so he's not saying here that you're bought with a price, therefore rebel. That's not what he's saying. He's just simply saying that regardless of if you have a master or what your condition is, use it to serve the Lord. I mean, all you got to do is read about Joseph down there in Egypt. He was not a free man, but he served the Lord. Daniel, all those people. See, Esther, we've been reading about her. See, they were slaves, but they were free in that they used their life, regardless of their circumstance, for the glory of God. Brethren, verse 24, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. So he kind of sums up what he's been saying. If you're single, then stay that way if you can. If you're married, stay that way. If you've been circumcised as a Jew, I don't know how you'd uncircumcise yourself. And then the other avenue is if you have not been circumcised, you're a Gentile, then don't worry about it. If you're a slave, don't worry about it. Serve the Lord. If you're free, use it better for the Lord. You're bought with a price. You belong to the Lord, so serve Him. So verse 24 really kind of sums it up if you look at it. All right? Now, then he begins to talk about another class here. Now, he talks about, it says, now concerning those who are single. And in verse 25, he says, now, obviously they've written, so he comes to this issue. Now concerning those that are virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. In other words, Jesus never touched on this matter in his earthly ministry. Yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful, that is, as an apostle. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. That is, the present in Paul's day. He's not talking about right now. He was talking about the time in which he lived. And he says, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. And believe me, there was a lot of persecution going on for believers as far as the Roman Empire was concerned. I mean, they were killing Christians, rounding them up and killing them. And so he's saying that, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man to be so. Art thou bound unto a wife? Then seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of that situation in the tribulation, to where it will be so hard for people to get food and to take care of their families, that those who are single, Paul said it's probably, you could talk about that present distress that will be coming. And, in a famine where people are starving, if a person just had to take care of one person, himself or herself, it might be easier depending on the situation. Verse 27, art thou loose from a wife? Seek not a wife. And so I want you to look at this verse. Art thou bound to a wife? Verse 27. Art thou bound unto a wife? Then he says, seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. Now, the interesting thing here is when you look in the Greek, which I have done, at verse 27, you have two different words for that word loosed. Art thou bound to a wife? It's talking about being bound in matrimony and marriage. Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? That word loosed, that second one, is the word divorced. It's divorce. He says, art thou bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But, and I want you to look at verse 28. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. Now, there's two kinds of people he's talking about here that evidently are single. One is the virgins who have never been married, and the other is those who have been divorced for the right causes, which the Lord does deal with. Verse 28, but, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. So the Bible does make, I believe, exceptions for marriage and divorce in some situations, evidently. And so that would take me back to that verse that I told you I was going to look at. And I don't remember, I didn't write it down. I think I did. Let's see. Verse 15 in that chapter. I said I'm going to come back to this. Back to verse 15. But if the unbelieving depart, let them depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such a case, but God hath called us to peace. And I think the idea here is that if your partner divorces you, that you are not under bondage. You're not under bondage in that matter to that marriage vow, that a person can remarry. There are those that believe that once you've been married, that you are married forever, world without end. Now, obviously, that is God's plan in the Garden of Eden. God's original plan before man fell was that there would be one woman and one man, and they would live in perfect harmony forever. That was His plan. But because sin entered into the world, God allowed divorce. I don't know if I can find it or not. I didn't write it down. I think it's in Numbers or Deuteronomy. Let's see if we can find it. Where, I don't know where it's at. Where the Lord talks about divorce to Moses. Let's see, where is that? I don't know if it's Deuteronomy. I wish I'd have written it down, and then we wouldn't be at this situation. What is it? Deuteronomy 20. Yeah, that's what I thought it was. That's just what I was going to say. You don't know I wasn't going to say it. All right? But you'd be right if you said I wasn't. All right, Deuteronomy 24. Now let's watch this. Obviously, in the Garden of Eden, God intended for marriage to one person, one man and one woman forever. That was under the perfect environment. But sin entered in. Now watch this. God says, when a man hath taken a wife, now this is under the law. This is under the law. When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that he find no favor and she find no favor in his eyes. Now probably he may find out that she has been immoral. I don't know. They're not clear on that. Then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it into her hand, and send her out of his house. Verse 2, and when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. Is that what it says? Now, she was married. She got a divorcement, a bill of divorcement, and she can go out and marry somebody else. And now she's no longer married to the first guy. She's another man's wife. But the teaching many times today is, even though we've been divorced, for 20 years, she's still my wife according to God. But that's not true. Okay. And then watch verse 3. And if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and give it to her hand, and send her out of his house, and if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her what? Her former. Notice that first husband is called former. He's no longer her husband. He's the former husband. She's now another man's husband. Now, those are important words. And her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to his wife after that she is defiled. That is, after. And the defiled here is not talking about an immorality in this context. It's just talking that she has been, she's been with somebody else now, another husband, which was legitimate according to the text. So these fellows who make all this hoop-de-doo about marriage and divorce, and I'm not for divorce. I have never in 50 years advised anybody to get divorced. Murder, yes, but divorce, no. So don't go out of here saying, I believe in divorce. I don't. I don't believe in polygamy. I don't believe in cancer, but I had it. So just because something is permitted, just like Paul is saying here, a person can leave, or you can stay single, or you can remarry if necessary. These are, issues that people try to just make black and white. And they run into all kinds of trouble. Let me tell you a story, true story. All my stories are true. Some of them have been embellished a little, but they're true. But this one is not embellished. A good friend of mine, as good as any friend I've got, who is a pastor, I ordained him, married him, and so on. He and his wife got a hold of a book some time ago, and it was written by an idiot. It was. The guy's an idiot. I read the book. And I don't think the guy's saved, to tell you the truth. But the gist of his teaching was this: that when you are married to one person forever. Therefore, if you ever get remarried while your first spouse is still alive, you are living in adultery. Then he goes over to Corinthians where it says, I think we just read about it. I don't know what my problem is here. Over in Corinthians where it says that, we read it here, we dealt with it here a couple of weeks ago, where it talks about the effeminate and the whoremongers and the idolaters and the covetous and fornicators will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God. Remember that? Okay. So he takes this text. If you're living with a second wife and your first wife or husband's still alive, you're living in adultery. Corinthians says fornicators are not going to heaven, not going to inherit the kingdom of God. Conclusion. That means if you have a second husband or wife and your former wife or husband is alive, you're living in adultery and you're not going to heaven. Now, conclusion. The proof that you are really a child of God is you put away your second husband or your second wife. And if the other one is, you have to break up the other marriage and all those marriages so that everybody can get back together as God put them together. You understand that? Okay. That church used to have 150 people. I just talked to a fellow, a missionary who preached there recently, He said, I doubt if they've got one complete family in the church. You understand? Now, let me take this a step further. That means that if that teaching is true, you could never let a divorced, remarried person join your church. It'd be impossible. Well, they're adulterers and fornicators. Right? Now, if I had a couple that's unmarried, never been married, and they're sitting up here living together, that'd be an abomination. But if I had a couple over here, and both of them, or maybe one of them, or both of them, had been married before, and they're divorced, and now these two are remarried, people think it's okay. But according to that teaching, they're living in adultery as much as this couple. So I can't let them join my church. You couldn't do it. You couldn't do it and be consistent. So my dear friend is consistent. He emptied his church. You see? So I'm not for divorce in any way. I'm not. I'm not for it. But I don't believe that people I don't believe it's the unpardonable sin. You know. All right. And let me just hurry up and go along here. So I made it very clear, I hope, that there in verse 27, it says, Art thou bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. And then in the next verse it says, Art thou loosed? That word is divorced. You can check it out in your Strong's Concordance. Art thou divorced from a wife? Seek not a wife. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she has not sinned. See, notice one's a virgin, the other one isn't. One's a divorced person. It says if they marry, they have not sinned. But I say, well, let me go on. Obviously, verse 28, nevertheless, she shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. And the idea there again is when people get married, they have trouble, and they have to care for each other. That's all that means. Verse 28, but and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, verse 29, but this I say, brethren, the time is short. Now he believes the Lord is coming soon. Paul believes the Lord is coming soon in his day. And he said, I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives and those that will be as though they had none. And Paul, in verse 39 through 40, he talks about those who are widows. And he said they are free to marry, down in verse 39. And Paul's personal judgment is that they'll be happier, verse 40, if they remain as he is. And I'm going to stop there in verse 32. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried cares for the things that belongs to the Lord. That is a Christian who's dedicated to him. And how he may please the Lord. So there's the advantage of remaining single. But he that is married cares for the things that are the world. And that's not a worldly, in a negative connotation. But it's talking about clothing and housing and food and things of that nature. In this context, the word world is not carnal or wicked, but it's how he may please his wife. Therefore, there is a difference also between a wife and a virgin, I would imagine. And the unmarried woman cares for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy in both body and in spirit. But she that is married cares for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And verse 35, and this I speak to your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that which may attain unto the Lord without distraction. Okay? And we're going to stop right there because of our time. And Lord willing, next week we'll take up right there where we left off. Okay? All right. Let's stand together and we'll be dismissed in a word of prayer. And I hope you'll take some time to do a little research on that and, convince yourself one way or the other. Okay? Brother Mark, you want to dismiss us in prayer, please?
Father, we thank you for this opportunity we've had around your word, looking through Corinthians, and see these important things and how they can affect our lives. And Father, we just thank you for a pastor who makes it plain and clear.
Amen. Be sure and shake hands with someone. Good night. God bless you.